for those not yet familiar with Wild Brews, it's an online biodiversity talk show conceptualized and is brought to you by the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines. So this afternoon is not going to be the usual plenary presentation. This is going to be a special episode of Wild Brews. We will be having a talk show right here at the Philippine Biodiversity Symposium. Okay, so by the way, I'm Grace Ambal, and I'm going to be your host for this special episode. Okay, so some people are watching from the lobby, so we can proceed, okay? So Wild Brews has had 7 episodes so far. So the pilot episode was aired a year ago. And if you want to rewatch previous episodes, just go to BCSP's YouTube channel. And previous Wild Brews episodes are also available on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This afternoon, the special episode will be all about strategies for inclusivity in Philippine biodiversity and conservation. So we expect our guests to be discussing challenges and opportunities in raising environmental consciousness for Philippine biodiversity and conservation to be more inclusive of marginalized sectors. Okay. So since this is a special episode, we also have special guests. So joining us this afternoon are 3 lovely ladies. Our 3 esteemed panel of women guests are groundbreakers in Philippine biodiversity and conservation. And we are privileged to have Dr. Nina Ingle, Ms. Marion Daclan, and Denise Matias for this afternoon special episode of Wild Brews. Okay, so before we start, I'd like to give a brief background on our guest speakers. So Nina is a Davao-based conservation ecologist. She received her BS in Biology magna cum laude from the Ateneo de Manila University and her MS and PhD in Natural Resources from Cornell University. For those who have been involved in bat research or have undertaken research or biodiversity inventories anywhere in the Philippines, you have for sure used A Key to the Bats of the Philippine Islands that Nina authored. Nina is also very active in wildlife conservation efforts around the country, and her interests include Philippine eagle, forests and watersheds, and incorporating the natural environment into basic education, especially for those living in or near forests. Among her many awards is the Parker Gentry Award for Conservation from the Field Museum in Chicago. She is also founding member and previous president of the Wildlife Conservation Society of the Philippines, which is now the BCSP. And Nina is also currently the chair and CEO of the Foundation for the Philippine Environment and the president of the Ingle Trust Foundation of Davao. So from Davao City, let's welcome Nina. Nina, yung Miss Universe kaway-kaway naman dyan. All right. So we proceed to our next guest speaker. Marion Antonette Daclan is a senior advisor at the Deutsche Gesellschaft für International Zusammenarbeit, or GIZ. Hope I pronounced that right. Marion has been working in the development sector for more than 20 years in a multicultural and international setting. She has extensive experience in policy development, research, and capacity building on biodiversity conservation, ecosystem approach on fisheries management, climate change, and gender and development. So prior to working with GIZ, Marion worked in various international organizations. She is also a member of the University Center for Women and Gender Studies Foundation, Incorporated. And she is currently completing her master's degree in Women and Development from the University of the Philippines.
Recording in progress.
So from Quezon City, tama ba Marion? Let's all welcome Marion Daclan. Hi. Okay, and finally, we have our third lovely lady guest speaker for this afternoon, Miss Denise Margaret Matias, is a professor at the Eberswalde, so did I pronounce that right? University of Sustainable Development in Germany. So prior to joining the University of Eberswalde, Denise was involved in projects focusing on grassland sustainability in Mongolia, climate change adaptation, and indigenous forestry livelihoods in the Philippines. She graduated from the University of Bonn with a PhD in agricultural sciences and is an associate of the Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program in Asia. She is also a fellow of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, thematic assessments on sustainable use of wildlife species. So from Germany naman, let's all welcome Dr. Denise Margaret Matias. Hi. So these three ladies are our guest speakers for this afternoon. So welcome to Wild Brews, and thank you very much for accepting the invitation to be part of this discussion. Okay, so let us now proceed to the program proper. Okay, so as I've mentioned, we're going to be discussing the strategies for inclusivity in Philippine biodiversity conservation. So this episode of Wild Brew this afternoon is divided into three segments. So the first segment will tackle inclusivity as a biodiversity issue. The second segment, challenges to inclusivity. And the third segment, moving forward towards an inclusive Philippine biodiversity and conservation. So let us now proceed to the first segment. Okay, so we expect the guest speakers to please give a brief background on your experience in relation to the sector you are working with right now. And also let us know if inclusivity is indeed an issue in Philippine biodiversity for the sectors you are working in or with, and how are these sectors being affected by biodiversity degradation and environmental injustices. So let's start with any volunteers, or should Nina, you want to start first?
Thank you very much, Grace, and thanks to my colleagues here and to everybody who's part of the BCSP and especially Wild Brews. So for me, I started as a wildlife biologist, as you mentioned, Grace, and through fieldwork, I realized the importance of Indigenous people. I think this was especially with my dissertation research on Mount Kitanglad. So I needed to learn the plants because I was studying pollination and seed dispersal, well, especially seed dispersal. So I needed to be familiar with the plants. I got a local forester, but what I found is the person who knew the most was a local Higaunon man who was a honey gatherer with his father. He was in his 50s, and he taught me the names of hundreds of trees and plants. And he told me things about what animals ate their fruits or what birds visited their flowers. So that was my introduction to the knowledge of Indigenous people, their intimate knowledge of the environment. After my dissertation research, I came back to the Philippines and I worked with the Haribon Foundation. And there I learned from my colleagues about the importance of youth and education. So that has been a growing interest, especially education involving Indigenous peoples and also other rural residents. So currently I'm the CEO chair of the Foundation for the Philippine Environment. And I'm happy to tell you that we have programs for youth engagement and also for IP engagement. And I can say more about those later. But I do want to highlight why these sectors are so important. First of all, it's the numbers. So our youth comprise over 50% of our population. So from ages 0 to 24, that's 51% of the population. And even if we consider the 15 to 24, which is more likely our idea of youth, sort of excluding the younger children, that's 20% of our population, or 1 in 5 Filipinos. But who makes the decisions? It's usually the 11% who are 55% and older who actually now include myself. So that's with the youth, 50% of our population. Now, Indigenous people comprise 12 to 17% of the population. They belong to over 100 ethno-linguistic groups. So they really represent so much of the cultural diversity of the Philippines. But in terms of biodiversity, 75% of our forest and biodiversity areas are in ancestral domains of Indigenous people. So they are crucial to conservation. However, often both youth and Indigenous peoples are left out of the discussion. They're marginalized because they're young, because they're inexperienced, or sometimes the word is ignorant, sometimes for both. So it's crucial to have their involvement. They have a key role to play. The youth, especially with their innovation, their passion. The Indigenous people with their connection to the environment, commitment to their land, and that intimate knowledge of the plants and animals, and that spiritual connection to biodiversity.
Yeah. Thank you, Nina. So can we call on Marion?
Okay, thank you. Salamat, Grace, and good afternoon, everyone, especially to my colleagues here. First, before, as Nina explained that she was a wildlife biologist before and starting where she recognized the inclusivity. Actually, for me, it's the reverse. Before really focusing on biodiversity conservation, my first work was with the University of the Philippines as an RA for the University Center for Women's Studies. Back then, we still didn't have the gender term. So the project that was assigned to me was mainstreaming gender in the Environmental Management Bureau. So it's helping them develop their GAD. I was just an RA, but part of that research was really looking up literature, in understanding the role of women. At the time, the focus was really on women when we were talking about gender. So, and all the studies, I think what came out really is that, there's still a lot of data gap. There's still a big gap in terms of understanding gender and how it connects to the environment. So that's when we started, to understand what gender and development is, and then eventually, I joined the biodiversity sector. And I'd like to ask the Secretariat to share my slide. I guess in answering the question whether inclusivity is an issue in biodiversity, of course, the answer is yes. And to further understand the issue of inclusivity, and maybe also to provide context and where I'm coming from, I'd like to discuss some key concepts as I bring in gender lens into the discussion of inclusivity in biodiversity conservation. So in the first slide, let's just wait for it. So I think the Secretariat is preparing it. So you will see later that I have identified four concepts for us to understand. First, gender. Gender is just a social construct. So I know most of us were raised in this binary gender model, which is only defined as men, women, masculine and feminine, male, female. But I think it's not such straightforward as we think. So I provide an illustration. We have this gender-bred person that, gender is not just men and women or male, female. There, you can already see it. Thank you. Thank you, Secretary. Keep it there. So I don't have time to, of course, discuss the details of the gender-bred person, but it's really just to note that when we talk about gender, it's not just about women, and it's more than male and female, okay? And we have, recognized all these identities and expressions as we talk about inclusivity. And of course, and the next concept is we talk about gender equality. In gender equality, we refer to that all gender identities have the same status and equal opportunities to access and even manage the resources. So, the other concept the next concept is equity. So it's the process of recognition of diversity and rights, procedures in relation to the decision making and access. So it's the process that we have to go through, and we believe it will help us achieve gender equality. And finally, we have the intersectionality theory, which is an overlap of the multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism. So it's the intersect of these concepts of and I think if you were able to catch Dr. Gideon Lasco's presentation earlier, he pointed out the sense of identity of Bantay Dagat. So I was actually happy when he said sense of identity, because in intersectionality, that's one of the things that we look at, that identity is formed by the intersect of one's gender, ethnicity, age, abilities, and all other aspects. So. And I think, and he also mentioned that identity in the gender advocacy. I think we also want to show that personal is political is a common rallying cry of advocates, and it underscores the connection of personal experiences with the larger society. So it's just like in biodiversity conservation or ecosystem management work, we recognize all these connections, no? So ecosystems. So we have the biotic and abiotic components, and we work with biodiversity. So we work with individuals, we work with organizations, and the bigger ecosystems of community and the society. So our usual call is we leave no one behind, and therefore we need to open our eyes and see everyone, and not just the sectors whom we want to see, right? So it's can go on with a long history of feminism, but I'd like to show the next slide. If the secretary can pull up the slide, the other slide, just to, again, I just want to highlight, I mean, why are we focusing on, thank you, Secretariat, for that. So we're a lot of, most of the audience are researchers, and one of the things that are important to us is data. And if you're familiar with OECD, they made an analysis. They look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals are the 17 goals with 169 targets that were set by the UN countries to achieve a better and sustainable future. And based on their analysis, they saw that 104 out of 246 indicators that they have listed are actually identified as gender-related. And most of these indicators actually pertain to people goals. And conversely, there are few gender-related indicators for planet goals. So with no indicators actually relating to oceans and biodiversity. So as you can see in the chart, that they show that there's actually a big data gap, and in practice, the data available are only for 35 indicators out of the 104 gender-related indicators. And of course, since it's not required, there's no gender-related data in regards to goals under biodiversity, both land and in the ocean. So just an example for us, when we leave out, when we leave out data, how and the key challenge now is how we can, develop the appropriate programs and policies to address a more inclusive action. So thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Marion. So may we now hear from Miss Denise?
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. And I would just like to pick up on what Marion and already what Nina mentioned. So I started my work with Indigenous Peoples when I was still in university. So Nina and I went to the same university and also the same program. And I was part of the Loyola Mountaineers of Ateneo de Manila University. And we had this project called Care for Gabaldon, so where we were helping indigenous dumagats, reforest, supposedly their ancestral domain. And so I saw one question already from Maria Angelica Pilar asking, in our opinion and based from our past experiences, what is the biggest hindrance towards inclusivity? And if so, how do we address this hindrance or barrier? And from my experience during that time, of course, we were Athenians going to Cabaldon in Nueva Ecija, trying to help with the reforestation, or actually rainforestation. But there were instances actually wherein, people would joke around saying like, oh, mukha ka ng dumagat. Oh, you already look like a dumagat. Because, climbing mountains, you get really dark, etc. And it was a joke. But looking back, I questioned myself, like, that's actually not just a joke. It has deeper roots of, in a way, racism against our own indigenous communities. And of course, I also invite everyone in the audience to be mindful of how we do these jokes when we go to the field, for example. And that's, I guess, the onset for me of what already Marion was mentioning about concepts like intersectionality, etc. So to answer Maria Angelica's question, it's a bit rooted in Philippine culture that the indigenous peoples are quite discriminated against. And Nina mentioned something about education. And in our visits to indigenous communities, they are discouraged to go to formal schooling because they said like they're always taunted. So they're always discriminated against in the mainstream schools. So people or the other children, as young as those, they already know how to discriminate. So it's something within the Philippine society that how is it that young kids already discriminate other indigenous communities? So in one of my researches done with indigenous Tagbanoas in Palawan. So these are also honey hunters, Nina. And so I took as a proxy for indigenous ecological knowledge, their knowledge or their identification of the giant honeybee or Apis dorsata. And so, of course, we used some surveys, interviews, and then I did some statistical work, and it was quite robust. The results showing that indeed the higher probability of identification is correlated with lower formal schooling. So it means that those who are not very well educated, they can actually identify more very well the honeybee species. So it's also a question for us, like also for the Department of Education, for example, always pushing like, oh yeah, everyone should go to school. But it's a different story when it comes to indigenous communities. So they have their own practices, they have their own sort of seasonal calendar, for example. So already one of the indigenous kids were saying, we hope that the formal schooling would be able to adjust when we need to help our parents in the field, for example. So indigenous schools are very much needed, I would say, and not just to try to assimilate the indigenous children to a former school. So we always make a distinction between assimilation and integration, because assimilation means that we want people to be all the same. So, but integration is different in the same that, okay, we all belong to the same society, but we retain our differences. In this case, one is indigenous, or some of us are not non-indigenous. So, and we also got a comment now from Rene Paalan, such actions by children are simply copies of their elders. So yes, definitely there needs to be something needs to change. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you, Denise. So we all agree that based on the experiences of our three guest panelists that indeed inclusivity is a big issue in biodiversity conservation. And probably we need to change mindsets of people working on the ground on how we can address this issue. I would also like to call on Nina or Marion if you would like to has been posted by nawala. Where's the question? Yeah. Oh, nawala. Oh, because it's answered na. Okay, but Nina or Marion, do you want to respond to that question?
Thank you, Grace. Yes, you just mentioned mindset. And actually, Denise was talking about mindset. And I think mindset is such a huge hindrance. So mindset saying young are ignorant, wala pang alam. That is a common view of people who are older, but it doesn't recognize how much the youth do know from their own experience. They have personal experience with the environment. There's a difference in the point of view of the perspective of youth compared to older people who may be jaded, who may no longer be paying attention. So I think dismissing youth as ignorant, wala pang alam, naive is one. Not yet able to contribute, maghintay ka muna, bata ka pa. And there's also, as Denise was mentioning, that mindset of Indigenous people are ignorant. And I want to read a quote from David Orr, which I just love. He said, David Orr is a prominent environmentalist and educator who said, the only people who have lived sustainably on the earth without damaging it could not read. This does not mean they were ignorant. To the contrary, they had enormous amounts of knowledge. Indigenous people's knowledge of their ecosystems is extensive. We will never be able to match it, but yet our concept of success, of knowledge, of education does not value that knowledge, that education from life experience and from teaching from elders and from the community. So I think mindset is a huge obstacle to inclusivity.
Okay, follow-up question to you, Nina. How do we address IP traditions that are often very patriarchal in practice? This is from Paulo Pagaduan. I would like to request everybody, can you also please indicate your institution so that our guest speakers would also know where you're coming from? Thanks. So Nina?
Right. So talking about patriarchal practices. Well, actually, I think society is changing. I mean, most societies have been patriarchal. This is, if we look the world over, that is, and Marion can tell us more about that. But I was just talking to a colleague who was talking about how Indigenous groups address issues, and she was saying the elders ask everyone to speak. So there's also the giving voice to each person, each group. And I think sometimes it's just expanding on that. Perhaps traditionally it has been listening to the men. In Western culture, that has actually also been the same point of view. But I think societies are changing and are realizing the value of the female contribution, the feminine contribution, the contribution of women. Marion can probably say more to this.
Yeah. Okay, Marion. So
okay,
if
thanks,
you want to,
Nina. Yeah, when you talk about mindset and culture, we're talking about thousands of years, of so we're over hundreds of years, that we've been brought up. This is right. Patriarchy is the system that's really been running the world, and I'm glad that Nina is very positive about it. I mean, come to think of it, the women's movement only just begun, a little more than 100 years, I think, when the first wave of feminism started. So we're making progress, yes. And when we talk about barriers in terms of biodiversity conservation work and in interacting with our communities, we deal with these gender stereotypes that usually hinders participation, not only from men and from women, but also from men, because men are expected only to do this task. They cannot, for example, cooking. So you cannot, it's for women's work. So those are some of the gender stereotypes that have usually, if you go out in the field, these traditional gender roles are still existing. Although we are have more open mind. We're more open-minded now, but a lot of women, a lot of men are still affected by this, stereotypes, this society's expectation. And for biodiversity conservation work, for the workers and even for our communities, we also have this barrier of safe space. I mean, it's the reality of women's movement in the community. When we go out in the field, when we go to the up in the mountains is different. Our precautions, the things that we have to watch out for is a lot different from, the men's experience. So those are some examples of barriers that I think that we're still facing as workers, as advocates in biodiversity conservation. But as Nina pointed out, I think we're making progress. I think we have a lot of advocates, and there have been a lot of changes, and even in our laws, we have laws that have already started looking into empowering women. And even I mentioned earlier, there is still a lot of data gap. We still don't have those gender disaggregated data to really understand, how to develop policies that would, perfectly would better address the different needs and both practical needs of the people, to be more inclusive. But we're getting there, and that's I think having this Wild Brews on inclusivity is a big step. I mean, it's the first time actually in the years of WCSP or BCSP that we have this discussion on inclusivity and biodiversity.
Okay, thank you. Actually, we've already jumped on the segment to discussion, but it's okay. Actually, everything that we've been discussing right now cuts across all the three segments. So we'll just not partition the discussion. So we'll just continue with what we're doing right now. So Denise, do you have anything to add to what Nina and Marion has said about the challenges in inclusivity? Yeah.
So I think for me, the question of Paulo on how do we address IP traditions that are often very patriarchal in practice, it's something that I still grapple with. So the last one of the work that I did was with honey hunters, and so the gender roles were very much delineated, and I would say their community works properly because of this different gender roles. And so I stopped myself, of course, from giving any prescriptive advice saying like, maybe women should also go to the forest and hunt bees, for example, because the current system works anyway. And I think, especially for us researchers, we always have to think that change should come from within. And it's not us who should be prescribing these changes to them. They have to wish or want to have these changes. The only thing that we can do, of course, is to bring it to the table and say, okay, these are some of the issues being discussed elsewhere. And of course, part of it is also what Nina mentioned. It's this Western construct, for example. And so these are, for me, it's still a very much open question if we should really address this patriarchal practices.
Okay, thank you. As pointed out by Marion and Nina also, it would take time for change to take place, but it's happening. We're getting there. So we have another question, this time from an anonymous attendee. So can we please, the anonymous attendee, can you please write your name and also your institution? But I'll read your first question. Okay, what kind of changes or policies do you think the government side of conservation should we implement to aid in this goal of inclusivity? So, any of you three ladies would want to respond to this? Marion?
Okay. Actually, I also want to add on to just also give my insights on the first question on the patriarchy and the IP practices. I think that's also where intersectionality comes in. So you don't only look at the gender side of when it comes to developing your programs, or in terms of understanding your partners, your community partners. You look at the intersect of their culture, their ethnicity. So I think that would help. But again, it is a challenge, and you and the community would know better, since you're the one who's working together, especially the communities. They would know better in terms of how it would, what would be the best thing for them to do. So just my insight there. And in terms of policies, in the goal of inclusivity. So I think I also have a slide there, but it's just an FYI. That's for my, I think my third slide for this segment is the Magna Carta for women. So we have that law in place, and it's it's quite new. It's just was enacted in 2009. Again, you say, oh, it's just about women, but it's not just about women. It's also having being mindful of data in terms of gathering your data, especially for national agencies, that they have to have this gender disaggregation, and this will use this data that they have, and hopefully it will be translated into proper and more inclusive programs and actions by the government. And it also includes, provisioning of budget when it comes to gender and development work of our partners. So this is not just limited to the PCW or the Philippine Commission of Women, but also all agencies, government agencies have this GAD budget. We have DNR as a GAD. I think we work with, I mentioned earlier, I work with the Environmental Management Bureau, and they use their GAD budget to develop their GAD plan. So.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And there's a follow-up question from our anonymous attendee. Can you please, whoever you are, can you please write down sa chat box na lang your name and your institution so that you will be properly recognized. So his or her follow-up question is, this marginalization of IPs is likely to be remnants of Spanish and American colonial legacy in the Philippines. Do you think a wider effort of decolonization is necessary in the issue of inclusivity? So do you want to address that question, Denise, first, and then Nina?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I think this is a very good answer to the previous question, like what kind of changes or policies do you think the government side of conservation should implement? And so we are aware of this already. And however, I think a lot of studies also point out, like, we've been colonized for how many centuries, and so this is really a big effort that we need to do, especially for us working in conservation, again, especially working with Indigenous communities. And I remember from our project as Loyola Mountaineers, someone pointed out that the Filipino or the Tagalog word for Indigenous is katutubo, which means that we are coming from them, because it's tubo, like roots, and we're actually rooted from these people. And so it needs a reverse in a way that we actually need to recognize that we are actually coming from them, and that we just simply need to acknowledge. But it's a big ask, I would say. I don't have the answer how to do this decolonization, because it's very deep rooted within the Philippine society. And like, just off tangent, we already know about the issues of whitening products, etc. and also the backlash against such. But still, it's a big chunk of the Philippine society wanting to be white, wanting to be just like the foreigners or the colonizers. But as researchers in the conservation field, I think we can start making efforts for this one, for the decolonization that anonymous attendee has brought up. So thank you very much for that.
I don't think, we always use history as an excuse to do what is needed to be done. So I guess we have to gear away from that and start doing, and with the excuse of because we were colonized, we have retained all the practices and stuff. So stop using history siguro as an excuse. So Nina, do you have anything to say?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question and a very important observation. And I think for me, the solution is celebrating the local, celebrating the diversity, because I think that's true for both biodiversity, for ecosystems, and for cultures. The Philippines, and we also see this in Dr. Wem Bukarin's comment, the Philippines is so diverse. It's an archipelago with so much diversity, actually the same biogeography that led to the speciation and great radiation and diversity that we find in Philippine biodiversity also contributed to the cultural biodiversity. And we need to celebrate what do we have on a local level. We often celebrate international levels, for example, mastery of English. But what about the local languages? What about the local cultures? What about the local the local richness that's only found in our area? So for example, in Davao City, there are 6 IP languages. There are more IPs that are part of it, but there are 6 IP groups involved in the DepEd IP program. So we've been working with them. They have different languages. These languages are different. And it's so amazing that there's so much richness in just one place that I did not learn about this when I went to grade school in Davao City, when I went to high school. So there's this local richness that we don't celebrate locally. So I'd really encourage all of us to look locally and then share beyond, share regionally, share nationally, share internationally, what we have that is so rich. There's a diversity in language, cooking, so much diversity. And the foundation really is our ecosystems, is our biodiversity, because that's where these differences evolved. How do we adapt to our environment? How do we find different ways of having crops, or collecting from the forests and the seas? What is that knowledge of those places? What do people locally know about the forest, the seas, and the language? And that, I think, will help us address colonization is saying the dominant culture, which may be a Western culture, is the superior culture, and it's not valuing the diversity. And if we don't do that, we're going to lose this culture, this language. And I would like to especially highlight the value of languages, local languages, because in those languages are terms which have so much information and pride also. So anything we can do to also support and maintain local groups, local languages, and their culture will help ultimately protect local biodiversity.
Okay. Thank you, Nina. So again, there's a follow-up question from anonymous attendee. So maybe Marion, you can answer this. When we go to the field, gender relations is still quite an issue, not just with local communities, but also among fellow researchers, conservation workers. So this is true for both women and LGBTQIA+ individuals. So thoughts on how our community should address this? So Marion?
Okay. I'm not sure if I got the challenge is what the gender relations challenge, or how is it an issue? Although I would say I would do a gender analysis, but in all practicality, not all projects can do that. It's not covered in all researchers. Of course, we have specific objectives, but when it comes to women, and you mentioned already LGBTQIA, it's really, we start from self, and it is similar to the IP issues. In people, the communities have to recognize that it is an issue, and for our part of our advocacy, really, when you start in the empowerment work, you start with self desensitization. I mean, you understand, yourself. What is the issue? I mean, are there any barriers because of your sex, because of the gender that you are being faced with, and how we're going to address this? And it's the same thing for the community. You understand, just listen to to the community, listen to what they have to say. And of course, you don't have to address all of these issues, and there are a lot of gender relation issues, and just, maybe you can just link them up with the proper agencies, with how to get the proper support for dealing with this. But I guess when going into the field, doing your research, keep an open mind, listen, respect and what's there, and recognize what each individual can contribute to your work.
Okay, thank you very much, Marion, for that very insightful response. Now, pang Miss Universe. So Nina or Denise, do you want to add anything to what Marion has said? Or we'll proceed to actually, next comment is from Ma'am Weng Bukirin, which Nina actually already addressed, but I'd like to read it so that everybody would know. From my view as a historian and heritage conservationist, inclusivity has to be appreciated in context, in time, space, and culture. As a matter at levels, scale, hence in land scale and seascape and mindscapes. Ecosystem and ethnology are a great enrichment of what can really work. May I ask any of the speakers, do you think it better to work at the local or regional or national level in archipelagic Philippines? I think Nina already addressed this, but if Marion or Denise would want to add anything. Yes, Marion.
Yeah, I'll just add, well, I don't know what's better, but I think it's both, all of these three work in a local, regional, national level is very important, and it has to be aligned. Hopefully, we have to align, and so that we can better address the heritage, the biodiversity conservation work that we need to do.
Yeah, definitely, we need to work at all three levels and all scales that Ma'am Weng has mentioned. Now, we have a lot of questions still. Would you prefer to just go through the questions and you answer, or do you want to move forward to the segment and discuss based on the guide questions that were given to you as speakers? Or would you rather just respond to the questions as they come?
I think
Kasi actually all of that cuts across all of the segments na eh. So
yeah, that's true. And
okay, so we'll just go through the questions and then you respond. Okay. So next we have question from Renee Paalan. Can we also view the separation of roles, men versus women, as complementary actions or a way of men protecting an expression of care, love for women? So,
Okay. I'll try to respond. Of course, yeah, it's the separation of roles of men and women. Of course, these are traditional gender roles that we're all accustomed with. We know about this. I mean, it's expected. We see it in books. We see it in the media, and of course, we witness it in the community. So if we currently, I think the common view is really still separated. And like I said, it's understanding. understanding the men, women, understanding communities, and I think when it becomes an issue when you take it against somebody who does not follow the traditional gender roles. So, I don't think we're prescribing that we have to remove these roles. I mean, it really is a process, but I think the challenge is not to place ourselves in a box when we think of activities, we think of programs, conservation, just based on these traditional roles that we expect. Yeah. So yeah,
Completely agree with that. Yeah.
protection, expression of love. It can also be an expression of love by women. There are different. I mean, there are just different ways, and we just need to be open.
Nina, do you have anything to add to that? Or Denise? So anything the men can do, the women can also do, and vice versa. So yeah. The work is only for women. Another set of work is only for men. So okay. So we'll proceed to the next question. But let me read the comment from Ma'am Letty Afwang. Sorry. Oops, I'm lost. Kasi I'm toggling between the chat box and the Q&A box. So the comment from Ma'am Letty is the effort of inclusivity actually comes from the outside people who try to get into the established systems of peoples like the IPs. When we look into their way of life, they have been generally content and self-sustaining. However, when the educated researchers and experts come to them, their ways of life are agitated. The effort for inclusivity should be geared towards protecting them, sustaining their culture and uniqueness, and opening their levels of understanding of the outside world. So they are not abused, taken for granted, and eventually wiped out. Completely agree with you, Ma'am Letty. Okay, so that's just a comment from Ma'am Letty. And then we have another question from William Tan. This is more related to the ethnicities rather than gender, but this is related, I hope. Why does it matter that we have equal access to studying wildlife and not just let foreigners do it? Just out of curiosity on something that bugs me. So Nina, would you want to say anything about this?
Yes, I think for me, what I'd love to see is research is done by local people. By Filipinos, but especially by local people. So because then that information is shared with the community, and it's the same thing actually applies to if it's done by research is done by Filipinos, because we all have our groups. We all have the people we communicate with and the mechanisms for communicating. So if we're a foreigner, we're going to communicate with a different group of people, and that's fine. But we also want to be communicating with fellow Filipinos, and we also especially want to be communicating with people of that same area. And I think there was a comment before about sharing information, and that's so important, that information is not just shared with a small group of people, maybe put in a book, maybe, as I think was mentioned in a comment, or shared with a small group, but shared especially with local people or other people from the area, so we can cultivate appreciation and celebration of the richness, not just on a national level, but also at a local level. And I think that conservation work at all different levels, but especially at the local level, because without local presence, all of the other efforts cannot be successful. You always need to have people on the ground who are caring for what is there, whether it's culture, whether it's biodiversity, and somehow doing something to celebrate and conserve it.
Okay, Denise, do you have anything to add to what Nina said? Or...
Yeah, I definitely want to agree and second what Nina mentioned, because at the end of the day, you know the saying that you cannot manage what you don't know. So it's necessary that first of all, we can say that the knowledge of the local people. So what Wilhelm said, is probably richer, because we are the ones who are, or even the local ones are the ones who are interacting with the wildlife on a day-to-day basis. So they probably really know more than just the foreigners. And of course, from an ethical perspective, this has already been discussed. Ethically, is it good to just have type of a parachute science that you just go there, collect your data, and then leave, and then write it up in journal articles, for example, and which actually I think relates to a very good point that Ruben gave.
I should read this. Okay.
Yeah,
it's related to what you were saying. Okay, so comment from and question also from Ruben Gieb of PMCJ. When a budding or established scientist goes out in the field to conduct their research study, for the most part, they depend on the knowledge of locals, indigenous peoples. Amazingly, more often than not, the local and indigenous people have vast knowledge about the researcher's topic of study. So with the vast scientific information gained by the researcher, he publishes the technical information in scientific journals that promotes his professional career, even gain respectable positions that is highly paid. The sad part is the source of the knowledge does not even ever gain any societal benefit that raises their life status to a more comfortable level. Can this concept of inclusivity possibly raise the situation so that both the source of knowledge and the researchers mutually gain? Okay, so I guess Denise have already touched on this topic. So
and I'd like to continue.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So because I already replied to Ruben, but I'd like to share to everyone here that I think that was back in 2012, and I was working with Dr. Boquiren during that time. So at a CI site in Panalingaan, Rizal. So it's for the Mount Mantalingahan, and I went there for my master's research. And I clearly remember that one of the IP leaders asked me, "So you will get your master's degree, but what's in it for us?" So, and since then, this question has haunted me until now. And because he's right. I mean, in 2012, I was just this master's student, but now I'm a professor. And if I go back to that community, would they have had this progress that I already had? Definitely not. So how do we try to address this? Because as Ruben said, the sad part is the source of the knowledge does not ever gain any benefit. And one of the things that at least research has tried to do is to institutionalize giving back to the community. So at least when I was a postdoc in Spain, I had this project wherein we were required to do community protocols, meaning that before the project is done, we need to have an agreement with the community that what they would like us to contribute. So there are different types of things. So for example, with my professor that time, one community that they work with asked that they will be taught English. So this is like an agreement with the community that, hey, we allow you to conduct research here, but in return, this is something that you should give us. So this is one way that we could give back to them by using community protocols, meaning agreements of how we should give back. But another thing that I've seen is that a lot of community work, for example, is not when we do trainings for communities, local communities. Actually, we're taking a lot of their time, but we're not paying them. We're just saying that, yeah, this training could actually give you something. So, for example, how to use a GPS. And that's an opportunity cost. Them sitting there listening to us how to use a GPS, that time could have been used for them to actually collect whatever they could sell to the market. So in these instances, I would recommend that we also think about compensating their time, just how we professionals are compensated for our time, for example, with working. And so this is, I think this is something that I'd like to invite people to think about. And I've also mentioned this to Forest Foundation Philippines. I had that project with them a couple of years back, and that hopefully we also see the time of local communities as important, and then that they are also compensated for the time they spend with us.
Yep, definitely. Actually, in most of the field works that we're doing, we hire local communities or even IPs to help us out, but sometimes just for as guide or as people that can carry all our heavy stuff. Maybe we can next time we can develop like a sort of instrument and to how we can compensate them for the knowledge that they are sharing with us or actually helping us out in doing our research. So thank you for that, Denise. So we'll go to the next question posted on the Q&A box. This is from Errol Gatumbato. Hi, ladies. In many protected areas, inclusivity is still a concern when it comes to governance. In many areas, the PAMBs are still dominated by men. Only a few membership from communities and IPs, and are also dominated by representatives from government agencies, national and local. How do we address inclusivity concerns in PA management? So Errol from PhilBio. Yes, Marion.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that. Thank you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess we've always been repeating like understanding the gender roles and responsibilities, and the norms still influence these roles and responsibilities that the community take. And if you have this information, this knowledge, I think as for us who are working in the protected areas, it's now our responsibility to look at their building their capacities based on the gender roles and responsibilities that are there, and even what is the role of the IPs there, build their capacities. I think Errol's question pointed out another barrier, which is the glass ceiling. I know we have been recognizing women are very much involved in conservation work. IPs has been contributing a lot in our research, but there's this still a glass ceiling, meaning they still have limited access to making decisions. So in the decision making role is still limited, and maybe just to give a very a direct example, if you look at the DNR right now, there's only one female undersecretary. So and the rest are male. So there's and it's not just in DNRs, and it's in all of in a lot of national government agencies and even around the world. So so again, if you want to be more inclusive, let's recognize these gender differences, and how they are the limitations in their access and their control of the resources, and then let's come up with a capacity building that will help them access this resource and give them the voice, finding a safe space. Of course, we talk about building the capacities to make them more confident or to empower them to be involved in decision making. We can even go as simple as when we engage them. Denise mentioned about a lot of our researchers. We talk to the communities, and we get time. And I know women do a lot of unpaid labor, and bringing them to the barangay center means that they have to give up cooking, or you have to cook earlier so they can participate in an activity. So sometimes bring the activity to them. I mean, closer to them, bring the space there, and then wherein they can engage, they can be engaged, and they can be part of the decision making. So that's something I know. When we talk about government, it's still a lot of work, but if we build on this, recognize these inputs from our communities at this level, I think eventually it will, trickle upwards.
Yeah, this issue has been raised time and time again. How do we include inclusivity? How do we address inclusivity in PA management? Actually, if you would look at park rangers, Bantay Bata, Bantay Dagat, most of them are male. They don't hire females for one reason or another. So maybe, we should
Make
start
it
addressing
safe
that.
for women.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always the reason, because it's dangerous. But in the bottom line is, why is going up in the mountains in the first place dangerous for women? Why?
Okay, so Denise, you want to add anything? Okay, so Nina, is there anything?
Yes.
you would like to say?
Well, maybe just we recognize that, yes, there's been certain groups are not included. I think Errol's comment is especially about protected area and management boards, but as Marion was saying, this is true in many other arenas. And I think this is the core of this session. How can we be more inclusive? Maybe more generally, when there are groups that are underrepresented, and I think this also relates somewhat to Paul Rigor's question, succeeding, is when there are underrepresented groups, one strategy is always to give them the voice. So that group, sometimes it's trying to involve, can we increase the number of women in this group? But the other is, can there be a group of women that has representation? And sometimes you can't make it formal representation because, for example, the PAMBI, it has a structure, so which is by law. So it's very hard to change that, but there can be informal by our anonymous attendee about sort of how can we not be messiahs, the messianic. So, because when you're a messiah, we're saying we can express the needs, or we can express the context of a certain group. But what we want to do, I think, is find mechanisms for having the voices of those who we usually don't hear from heard. And often it's giving them an arena, because they may not have control of the arena. And I'm thinking of youth, for example. It also applies to women and many other groups. Maybe they don't have the capacity to get together. Maybe they don't have the travel money, or they don't have the load to get on to Zoom but maybe there are mechanisms that can reach out to those groups so that they can meet together, share their ideas, and then we can help make mechanisms so that those voices can be transmitted to maybe decision makers like the PAMBI. So the PAMBI may or may not follow the suggestions, but at least they would have heard these voices. And I think for me, that's also what Paul Rigor is saying about how can we encourage and include different social classes. Often it's a lot of legwork, and I know it's very challenging, and many people are working and groups are working on it, and it takes time, but let's just keep doing that to foster communication within groups, among groups, and eventually we do see this bearing fruit. I mean, actually BCSP, the Biodiversity Conservation Society for the Philippines, is such an example of bringing people together and also listening to others who have not always been so included in our group. So just to, again, talk about youth, some years back, we had this special session for high school students in the Biodiversity Conservation Society for the Philippines, so we could hear their voices, and many of those are now doing a lot of work. So reaching out to those groups and giving them a voice, a seat at the table, and letting their voices be heard.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Thank you, Nina, for that very insightful response. There's another question posted by Paul from the Philippine Carabao Center in Nueva Ecija. I believe that inclusivity is more than just an acceptance of the equality of genders and their roles within and among societies. So for environmental conservation, how can we encourage and include different social classes to get engaged in activities that will be beneficial to the environment and our IPs, with them knowing that their work will benefit the IPs, the ICCs more than them? Thank you. So, and if you want to respond to that, there. So,
I think I'd like to connect that with a question from Gazelle Rule. So as we pursue towards inclusivity in biodiversity conservation, we could not avoid the hesitancy embedded in some tribal groups. So how can we address this problem in integrating with indigenous systems and scientific pursuits? So again, first and foremost, especially with local communities and indigenous communities, we need to have FPIC, so free, prior, and informed consent. So I really don't understand much what hesitancy in this context means, but at the very first level, we always need to have communities, or even just us, right? So we need the consent of people, whether they want to engage or not. And if they don't want to, we have to respect that. So similar to us, if you don't want to have your photo taken, then don't have it taken. So just stand your ground, for example. So, and for Paul's question, which I think Nina has already touched upon earlier, definitely there are opportunities for different social classes to get engaged. So for the rich ones, they do philanthropy, right? So we also need to have structures ready for that. If some institutions or some rich individuals want to get involved, we need to make sure that not just that we're welcoming these efforts, but also ensuring that it's not just greenwashing, for example, and also trying to safeguard the rights of local communities or indigenous people. So so definitely, again, for me, the very first step would always to get the consent of local communities and peoples, and not just to tick the checkbox of NCIP, right? That there needs to be FPIC. That's the technical side of things, but again, from an ethical and moral perspective, we just need to get the consent of these communities before we could even think about engaging in activities.
Okay, thank you, Denise, for that. There's a question here from Ruben that's related to that. And yung question then earlier. Are there any indigenous communities in the Philippines that give equal importance rights to women as men? And what lessons can we learn from them, if there is any? Do you know of any IP communities, or have you worked with IP communities? Men and women, the role of men and women are co-equal here in the Philippines? Nina or Denise or Marion?
That are equal?
Yeah.
So the assumption there's
Patriarchal.
equality in our IT
Yeah.
communities. Actually, there's been a lot of studies that already pointed out, even before the Spaniards came, actually women are more free. Before colonization came to the Philippines, we had divorce. We are familiar with the concept of babaylan. I mean, the babaylan is a priestess, and they have a say in the community. So I disagree that IP traditions or practices are that men and women are not equal, and maybe as you know, because tradition culture is that not of course not stagnant, it changes and it's influenced by a lot of things. And for example, I think Mom Rowie is here. She's more familiar with the experience, the culture at North. I mean, the culture of the Igorots. I mean, it's really women power. If you heard about the campaign, the Chico Dam before, it was really the women who pushed for the protection to, you know, to reject the project Chico Dam. It was being led by the women. So yeah, there are a lot of I think maybe Rowie and other resource persons can provide more examples. And yeah, and there's even, it's not only just women as leaders recognized, but there are also I don't know if you've seen this in terms of gender-based violence. I mean, in some cultures it doesn't exist. I mean, I think there's this movie, Walang Rape sa Bonto. Yeah, that's a very good example that they only came to know of the concept of rape when the Betamax culture came into their town, and that's really like, why? I mean, before that it was, you know, incomprehensible that such thing can actually happen.
Thank you, Marion. Nina, do you have anything to add to that? Or yeah.
Actually, I'm just going to type in the chat box. I would recommend the book by Stuart Schlegel about the Tiduray called Wisdom from a Rainforest, which also talks about both the biodiversity, the forest, and the culture. And I think it gives us an insight into relations within indigenous communities. This is the Tiduray in Mindanao from several decades ago, but relations are always very complex. So sometimes we look at just who is the spokesperson, but there's a lot of, often power is not, there are different ways of having power too. So yes, sort of, it's interesting sometimes to look deeper and see how that groups which might I think when we talk about inclusivity, and I think this relates to another question, we may want to avoid thinking of groups as victims. So they are victims, and I think this goes back to a comment on messianic, that we look at how these groups are managing to operate within the space, within actually sometimes constraints that are imposed by society, but they often have very creative ways of making their voices heard. And sometimes, though, we might find ways of making that heard in a wider perspective. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. Denise, do you have anything to add to that? We go to the next question. Okay, this is a question that is related to the one posted by Wilhelm about foreign researches. So what are your thoughts about paracute science? It's still quite common in our field, surprisingly. And what are your thoughts on non-Filipino researchers who are gatekeeping Philippine biodiversity data? So do you want to answer that? Or I might not be related anymore to inclusivity. So, or, but if you want to say anything about it, that feel free to. Do you want to respond, Nina?
Right. Yes. I'm not so sure if I get the same, if I really understand the concept of parachute science, but I think the person who's asking the question may be referring to foreigners who perhaps are working on a specific group and come in to collect information about that taxonomic group. That may be. I can think that because, for example, if one's a specialist of a certain group that's found, let's say, widespread in, let's say, Asia, maybe a bat or an insect or a plant, one often wants to, if one's coming from that point of view, one wants to get information about the species or taxonomic group throughout a range. And the research that is done by that kind of research is very, very valuable because it helps put our local context or our regional context or our national context in a broader context. So one is to acknowledge the value of those researchers who may actually, because of the kind of research they do, not be able to spend months or years of their life devoted to Philippine biodiversity. Perhaps what's important is the communication, so that maybe that researcher will be coming in and not staying long, but they establish ties to local researchers who help let them understand the local context so that they can behave in a respectful manner, respecting wishes, and of course, laws and guidelines, but also being able to communicate that information so that it can be shared locally. And sometimes this information is rather technical. For example, if it's taxonomic, and it may be hard for it to be appreciated, but perhaps this is part of appreciating everybody's contribution. So I do think that foreign researchers, especially specialists who do studies of broad groups, have a lot to offer. The importance, I think, is that of respect and being respectful of our national and local realities.
Thank you, Nina. Denise, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so actually, the parachute science is, from an ethical perspective, it's very much criticized. So because it's somewhat that they just go to a place and then they collect data and then they leave. But we already brought that up earlier, that it's necessary to have, at the bare minimum, the collaboration with local scientists, for example, because again, it's also a question, how do you want local science in the Philippines to develop? Do we want to just be dependent on foreign scientists to collect the data for us? Or do we also want to develop the capacity of local scientists, for example? And so this is related to the next question of non-Filipino researchers who are gatekeeping Philippine biodiversity data. And as Nina already mentioned, we would like to share the information as widely as possible. But I would say there's a caveat to a certain extent that it doesn't go to the hands of, for example, wildlife traders. And so we need to have this balance that we put out information, but to the point that, yeah, it doesn't go to the hands of wildlife traders, for example, or it doesn't compromise the security of local communities. So just to add, like, this is also an issue now in terms of publishing GPS coordinates of field sites, for example, in your publications, in journal articles. So yeah, so we really need to have this in mind when about the gatekeeping of data and with the parachute science. That again, I would also recommend using a so-called transdisciplinary approach with research, wherein the research is also drawing from the needs of local communities, for example, and that it starts from a bottom-up approach. So again, like what Nina already mentioned, celebrate the local. I think it also relates to this one.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. We digressed a bit from our topic, which is inclusivity. So we're having a really interesting and engaging discussion, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I'll probably read just one last question, and then for those who are still interested in continuing this discussion, you can contact any of the members of the organizing committee so that they can contact or link you with any of the guest speakers that you would want to engage more on this discussion. So, okay, so let's final questions siguro posted from Cynthia Layusa. Paano natin i-avoid naman ang pag-romanticize ng mga groups and sectors na ito? For example, sa IPs, we keep on saying that they are frontliners, but they are actually just living their own lives. How do we address this romantic notion and actually embrace inclusivity? So actually, this has been touched on by answers previously, but I don't know if you would want to respond, or do you have anything to say to the question posted by Cynthia?
Okay, me.
Yeah,
I'll
Marion.
just attempt. So I'm just not sure what we mean by the romanticization of their notion as frontliners. I guess it becomes an issue because when they cannot fulfill that role as we expect them to be as frontliners, for example, in their area, in the forest. And I think it's really, again, going back and answer the question, why are they not able to fulfill this role? I mean, they said they're frontliners, so why are they not able to do it? And let's understand the issue behind it. Maybe they don't have the resources to address it. Maybe they lack the knowledge, or maybe there's something more. Maybe they have to meet their basic needs. So, it's more important for them to get the food on the table than to, for example, protect the forest. So there's something, it's a long process. I think it was mentioned by Nina also earlier, that it's a process, and it involves a lot of organizing and understanding in our part when we engage the community. So yeah, I think that's my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. We've run out of time, so I'll just read some of the questions posted, and those of you who would want to hear what our guest speakers would want to say or have to say about these questions, please contact them directly. Okay, so some of the questions that I've posted is, how do you think we can go past token representation towards actual inclusivity in all aspects of conservation work? And then from Joshua Donato, there are some traditional protection and management of some indigenous here in Mindanao, which is very effective in forest and biodiversity conservation. Unfortunately, some of it were not respected by some concerned agencies. How can we help them integrate their knowledge into mainstream laws and policies, considering that most of our remaining forests are managed by IP communities? And then from Marius, I can't see his last name, intergenerational leadership. How can we address meaningful engagement among our IPs as we recognize their opportunities and collaboration? And then finally, from Justin Ray, posted on Facebook, advocates of science and technology for the people is working around 2 to 3 years back by creating school curricula for IPs that will fit their culture and their needs. I think this should be done by DepEd. Also, I hope that the harassment on Dumban schools should also be stopped. So Nina, okay. Do you want to address that?
Yes,
comment?
thank you.
Yeah.
I just actually typed an answer, and I will be looking up what Justin Ray mentioned. It is so important to have a school curricula that is relevant to the children from whatever background they have. And I think it was Denise who mentioned how some IP children didn't want to go to school. I've heard that too. And also that very saddening information that those who had gone to more school knew less about biodiversity. So having our education really fitting the needs and priorities of local people, especially IP people, is very, very important. The DepEd does have a program, the IP education program, that was started in 2011. So that's a big step forward, because before instruction was just in English and Filipino, and now there's instruction in local languages, including IP language, and of course the mother tongue based multilingual education. But I agree with the comment and of Justin Ray, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. But unfortunately, we've run out of time. Sayang, this session or discussion is really very insightful and engaging, especially giving insights on how researchers would have to make sure that inclusivity in biodiversity conservation projects that we're doing should be tackled and should be addressed. Okay, so siguro, I'm so sorry, but okay, Cynthia just posted, but mention that you could watch the replay on BCSP's YouTube channel for this session. So for those who would want to review the answers and the insights that our guest speakers have given us, provided us, you can go back and watch the video on BCSP's YouTube channel. So, okay, so thank you very much to the three ladies for their very insightful and engaging discussion. They have provided us strategies and lessons from the field. But before we wrap up and officially end this discussion, I would like to ask our three speakers to, if you have any parting words or words of wisdom that you would want to share with our viewers and attendees in this symposium. So we'll start with Denise.
Yeah, so for me, I got a lot of insights from Nina, Marion, Grace, but also from the audience. So I would just like to echo what Nina mentioned, like about celebrating the local, but also respecting it. So I think for our conservation work, inclusivity stems from these two things, like celebrating and as well as respecting our local counterparts. Thank you.
Thank you. Marion?
Okay, thank you, Grace. Thank you to my co-panelists here, Denise and Nina. I guess since I'm currently doing EPA, ecosystem-based adaptation, and I guess in that framework, we always look at our work not only on the use of biodiversity and ecosystems, but also looking at the benefits that our work will give to the people. So again, people-centric, meaning you also look at the differences, the diversity in there. And so already mentioned, the key there is respect. And more lastly, I think for our work is really multidisciplinary studies are really important. When you use a new lens, you see something new. I mean, this experience, all of us here have different backgrounds. So youth, IPs, and still biodiversity. So, you learn something new. And if you use a new lens, you find, you discover a lot of things, and it will help you, in moving forward in our biodiversity conservation work. Thanks.
Thank you, Marion. And finally, Nina?
Well, it has been a great pleasure to be part of this panel and to also have the interaction with our audience. I think one insight I have is we are respected, we are scientists, we are seen as experts. But what we find out with our experiences, we see so much knowledge and richness in groups. And if we see groups which are underrepresented, somehow do not have a seat at the table, and here we've mentioned women and youth and Indigenous people, but there are other groups, and they may be groups that we encounter. Sometimes we're part of a group that really has a program for certain groups, but even if we don't, listening to that group and maybe doing whatever we can to let them have somehow a seat at the table to be heard, or even just us listening, somehow changes dynamics. And sometimes we are outsiders. And so when an outsider pays attention to an individual or group that isn't maybe given attention in in the arena that they operate within, sometimes that changes the way others see them. So that's one way that in our daily lives as scientists and researchers, as many of us are, we might be able to promote inclusivity.
Thank you very much, Nina. My takeaway from this session is celebrate the local. So again, thank you, ladies, for all your insights on inclusivity in biodiversity conservation. So that concludes our second day of the 25th Philippine Biodiversity Symposium, and that also ends this session. A special episode of Wild Brews, sorry.